Hi, everyone. So we were speaking about what happened after the death of Prophet Muhammad, about how the early Muslim community uh, undertook a set of conquests, some would agree accidentally and then purposefully, across the Middle East. Um, and now I want to talk about the nature of leadership and succession after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and ultimately, how did the first so-called civil war fitna occur in the years after the Prophet Muhammad's death? So let's just do again a bit of review. After the Prophet Muhammad died, he did not clearly specify who was going to succeed him, nor what that nature of that succession would look like. That is, what kind of powers he would have, if he was going to be a prophet or a religious leader, and also what kind of religious priorities he would have. In the end, the title they'd settled on is Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful, or rather the commander of the believers. Um, Amir is a military title. Believers is the name of the most common name for the followers of the community of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, after Prophet Muhammad's death, a group came together to discuss basically who should take power and keep the community under one leadership. So again, that was ultimately entrusted to Abu Bakr, a close companion of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, he only survived for about 2 years until he died naturally. But in that process, he also defended against during this so-called Ridda War period, against the apostasy or the breaking off of the various polytheistic tribes that attempted to separate themselves from the community of believers now that the Prophet Muhammad had died. It was also under his rule that the initial conquests into Syria and Iraq began, even if they were kind of ultimately unintentional effects of the movements of the armies into those areas. Now, after him, he appointed Omar as a leader. So before we have a sort of consensus process appointing Abu Bakr suggests that Omar should be the next leader. And Omar is particularly responsible for a set of military battles that are occurring against the Byzantines, the Sasanians, and the kind of military expansions period. Ultimately, though, he's only around for 10 years because he's murdered by his slave, and what seems to be basically an issue of individual pique or disgruntlement rather than anything political about it. And after him, because his death was unexpected, Abu Bakr died. He was on his deathbed. He appointed Omar. Because Omar was killed, he was then the next leader was elected by a council. It's called a shura, and that is Uthman. And I want to get into Uthman and what ended up happening with him. Why was he ultimately murdered by disgruntled troops? So we're already basically 656. We're 25 years, less than 25 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and already the community is in the process of almost a civil war. Troops are murdering the leaders. And the same thing ends up to some degree happening to Ali, the fourth successor, who lived for about 5 years, and undertook kind of the first civil war, was ultimately assassinated by one of his own followers. Now, a few things here. All of these guys, they all knew the Prophet Muhammad personally. They're all very close and early companions of the Prophet Muhammad. These are not later, Qurayshis that decided to join the believers after the Prophet Muhammad took Mecca. These are people that were very close to his family. In fact, they were all connected to the Prophet Muhammad by marriage. Prophet Muhammad probably, can't remember exactly, but married their daughters, or in the case of Ali, Ali married the one and only living child of the Prophet Muhammad to reach adulthood, that is Fatima. And so he was also his son-in-law. They're also all members of the Quraysh tribe. So they're all a relatively homogenous group of people at this moment. That said, there was already tensions in this process. Ali, for example, some claim, and Ali may have claimed, that he was supposed to be the leader of the community after the death of Prophet Muhammad. He was the closest to the Prophet. He was also his son-in-law and his cousin, and therefore had the kind of best claim to leadership. Now, we're going to get into that and what that means and how that starts off a different branch, etc. But for now, just keep this in mind. We're going to delve a bit more closely into what did it mean to be a leader after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. By the way, these four guys, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, are referred to as the Rashidun, which means the four rightly guided leaders. But that's really in later sources. If you go on Wikipedia, that's what they'll call them. But at this point, they're not called that. So here we have the election of Uthman in the history of the early community by a historian called Balami. We can see basically a sort of electoral committee. We even see some women on the top here. And their faces have been rubbed out for some reason, but we see some basically, I think, Uthman being given leadership of the community. Uthman, as I pointed out, he was actually murdered, and he wasn't murdered due to individual disgruntlement, as the case was Omar. He was murdered by troops, by Arab troops, who came from Fustat, which is basically Egypt, outside of what would become Cairo, and Kufa, which is over in Iraq, who basically laid siege to his encampment in Medina because they were protesting how the spoils of the war were being distributed. So the new Muslim community was conquering many areas, was overwhelmed with the amount of loot and tribute that was coming in. There was not only the initial spoils of war, right? So how do you pay your soldiers back then? Well, they get time to raid a city or a place that refuses to surrender peacefully. In that case, you get to raid villages and attack places, take any number of people you capture can be sold as slaves. Valuables that you come into your possession are yours. The same, of course, goes with food and animals, which was probably animals being the easiest and most valuable thing to sell. And on top of that, all of these areas were also generally producing taxes, right? So one reason why they didn't want their soldiers to just raid villages to death is because they ultimately needed the taxes from those regions. And those taxes were not just sent back to Medina, they were kept under the control of a local governor, etc. And they were supposed to be being paid to the troops. So there was actually giant lists of who was on part of these brigades, and each was given a salary, essentially. But how much of it was supposed to go to the troops and how much of it was supposed to go to the leaders or the state? And how do you actually distribute out the spoils of war? So the Quraysh leaders already early on, and especially when they distinguished themselves in battle, were given very large estates throughout Iraq, Syria, and even Arabia, right? So some of the rebelling tribes during the Ridda Wars were enslaved, and their lands were turned into large estates that were then given over to the most faithful and efficient Qurayshi military leaders. And this, I think, became particularly central under Uthman, perhaps because he was a less stable leader. He had less clear legitimacy for his rule. He relied heavily on his own relatives in his own clan, and he gave them key positions. And this kind of went against the idea of the early Muslim community, the early community of believers, which again is a pietistic community. It's based off of the idea that we are a group united by our belief in monotheism, in behaving with piety, and being righteous people who are getting ready to be for the end of times. And instead, Uthman is putting in people like Walid ibn Uqba, who's going around getting drunk, even though in the Quran it says specifically that you shouldn't be drunk and you shouldn't be intoxicated, and you definitely shouldn't pray while intoxicated. And he's even caught in public being drunk, but he's not being punished. Muawiyah, another relative of Uthman, the son of Abu Sufyan, one of the major Meccan leaders, who refused to convert initially in Mecca, was not a follower of Muhammad until Muhammad took the city. Muawiyah is appointed the governor of Syria, probably one of the richest and most important provinces. The major military leader of Egypt, this guy named Umar ibn al-As, he's replaced with Uthman's foster brother. So every time it seems that Uthman is just prioritizing his own clan, he's prioritizing his own family in order to rule, but he's not looking at, in terms of merit or in terms of piety, as qualifications for running these places. Now, the other thing that made people mad about Omar is that he actually essentially had the Quran compiled into a written text. Now, remember, the Quran was just existing as various verses and chapters that people had memorized or heard and then passed on to their children, or to friends or to relatives in different times. And so no one really had like the entire Quran available to them. It's not like anyone had the entire thing memorized, right? Everyone had pieces of it. And they kept their pieces and they were proud of it. And there were small variations, right? Eventually, over time, there were regional variations between this. And what he did is essentially compiled. He created an official version, and then he sent those written versions out to the Amsar, the garrison cities with the collections of troops. And he takes these places and he asks that local copies and regional copies be destroyed. But some people, like Ibn Masud, another guy, who basically refused to hand over his copy, didn't want to throw away his version of the Quran, and just ignored Uthman's Quran. So this Quran, these are famous. These are seen, the moment when the Quran is written down. None of these still exist, but there's places like if you go to Tashkent, you can see one that claims to be it. It's a gigantic thing. It's like bigger than a desk. But this is actually a later Quran, probably from 300 years afterwards. But as far as we can tell, none of these exist anymore. But people believe that they're still around. And in fact, it's told that Uthman was reading one of these Qurans when the angry tribesmen come in, his troops come in and they murder him. And his Quran is stained with his blood, right? So he's stabbed in the back and his blood spills over and sneaks into the pages. And so Muslims throughout history had always been looking for this Quran with a big blood stain on it. Now, all of this is to say, which is why is it that the leader, the military leader of the community, again, he's the Amir al-Mu'minin, the military leader of the believers, has the right to say, what is the authoritative version of the Quran? Why should he have that right? That was one question that was being put forward. And by compiling it, which is, I'm sure, a very useful and good thing, this created tensions within the community. Now, what ends up happening, long story, based off of pay and other questions, troops from Fustat, so near Cairo, and Kufa, which is near Basra in Iraq, and Basra, basically go back to Medina, march on Medina. It's like 1656. They want to meet with Uthman and present their case. He kind of refuses to. They surround his tent. Eventually, something goes wrong. Tensions break out. And they burst into his tent. It's unclear what happens, but basically gets murdered in the tent by these troops. Now, this is a problem. One, because this is still a tribal society in many ways. Revenge needs to be brought about, and it also implicates all of his clansmen, his tribesmen, the other Quraysh, who did nothing to help him, right? They were also frustrated with him for various reasons, or didn't go out of their way to defend him against these troops. No one in Medina at that point apparently was very supportive of him. But after he got murdered, he was basically they were implicated in his death. And that also extended to Aisha, the surviving widow of the Prophet Muhammad. She was married quite young to Prophet Muhammad. That's why she's still alive at this point. She also didn't lend her support to Uthman. So basically, he was killed because no one was supporting him. But once he was killed, people felt like, well, no, now someone needs to act, and someone needs to pay for the price of killing him. But at this point, the troops basically just went on their way back and were left unpunished. And this created a big problem for the succeeding leader, who would be Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law and cousin. A lot of his followers, his most loyal supporters, were actually some of the troops that who had killed Uthman. And he was now in this, he was going to reform the situation of distribution of goods, etc. He was going to create a more equal, more pious community. But all of a sudden, he found himself compromised by his very followers. And for this reason, he is basically sued, and his leadership is challenged by two people. One is Aisha, the former widow of the Prophet Muhammad, who says that, the perpetrators of the murder of Uthman have to be punished, but he is unable to do so. And two is Muawiyah, the son of Abu Sufyan, the guy who was a sort of bad guy for the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca, but and who had eventually converted. Muawiyah is ruling Syria, so he has a strong power base in Syria. And Aisha has a lot of followers just because she's the surviving widow of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this sets up the first fitna, or civil war. Fitna is a word in Arabic that just means like strife, sedition, but also a seduction of power, seduction in general. It's an interesting word in Arabic, and this is the word they use to describe this first civil war, when the community basically turns against each other and starts fighting. And so what we have here is a battle between Ali and his supporters and Muawiyah and Aisha and his supporters. And the Quraysh basically side with Muawiyah and Aisha, even though they never went out of their way to help him to begin with. In fact, they basically decamped from Medina and gone to Mecca when he was having these problems with these troops. Ultimately, Muawiyah starts a dynasty called the Umayyad dynasty, because he is the one who ends up winning, as we'll see soon. Now, there's a few battles here. The main one is the Battle of the Camel, and the other one is the Battle of Siffin. So one is over here by Basra, the other is over here in northern Syria. In the Battle of the Camel, Ali meets basically against his opponents. Ali gets the upper hand here. Aisha is completely defeated. It's called the Battle of the Camel because Aisha, which you can kind of see here, was riding in this litter on a giant camel, white camel. And so the fighting was fiercest around this litter, around this camel. So that's why it's called the Battle of the Camel. Aisha's defeated. She's exiled completely to Medina. She's not allowed to basically be a political companion anymore. Some of the closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad are killed. And this is, in a sense, again, a major event, right? People are being died all the time, but maybe they're being killed fighting the Byzantines or the Sasanians, etc., or maybe they fell off a horse. But it's one thing when another believer kills a believer, right? And this was specifically said, and even in the Ummah document, the so-called Constitution of Medina, it says that you shouldn't be fighting each other. And here we have a situation in which Muslims are fighting each other. To push up his support, Ali, he can't rely on the Quraysh who are against him, and he can't. And this also takes out the original group of muhajirs, the migrants from Mecca to Medina. So he turns to the Ansar, the helpers in Medina, and puts them in governor positions. Having eliminated Aisha, now it goes against his main enemy, which is Muawiyah, the governor of Syria. Again, who's also a relative of Uthman. So the next battle occurs here in northern Syria, in a battle called Siffin. Ali has the upper hand, but Muawiyah does something smart. They kind of skirmish for a while, but nothing's clear. It still seems that Ali is going to win because he has the better army and the bigger army. But Muawiyah puts essentially folios of the Quran on the lances of his soldiers and has them march forward. And because they have the word of God, the Quran, on their lances, they decide to stop. They don't know what to do. And at that point, Muawiyah demands arbitration. He says, we can fight here, but it would be better if a panel of experts decides what to do. And Ali reluctantly agrees. He basically retreats, even though he probably had the upper hand. He could have won, and decides to, rather than spill more blood, rather than kill more Muslims and more companions of the Prophet Muhammad, it would be better to leave this to arbitration. The arbitration takes a while. It doesn't result in actually in a good situation for Muawiyah, for Ali. But in the process of waiting and of negotiating, he is actually murdered by his own troops. Now, some of his followers were a group called the Kharijites, Khariji, Khawarij in plural in Arabic. What does it mean? Kharaja means to go out, to leave the community, etc. They didn't call themselves that, but that's how people thought of them. And I basically said that there cannot be. It wasn't up for Ali to decide to go into arbitration. It's not up for any experts to decide who is right or wrong here. That should only be decided by a battle, whose outcome would be controlled by God. And in fact, it's ultimately up to God to decide all of these things. We don't need a larger form of leadership. We don't need any of this stuff. And ultimately, we just need God to judge and to run everything. And so for this reason, these Kharijis were seen as leaving the community, the first community of believers, and establishing their own community. They were ultra pious. They were very strong believers. They really believed that the end of times is coming and that they needed to be as morally clean and pious as possible. And to do that, they needed to separate themselves from the majority of the Muslim community. They ended up going into different deserts, especially in Eastern Arabia and Yemen, etc. But in that process, a lot of the followers of Ali left him, became Kharijites, and one of them even ended up assassinating him. This ends Ali's claim. Afterwards, basically, Muawiyah takes over the entire throne, and he ends up being the new Amir, the new commander. But what we have here in this civil war is basically a set of different fights over what exactly are the rights and powers of the leader of the community. We know from the very beginning that he wasn't supposed to be a prophet, but is he more than just a military leader? Should he emphasize piety, or should he emphasize kin and clansmen in terms of who gets promoted and who has to rule? How should the spoils of war be separated, and ultimately how pious should these leaders be? Even a figure like Ali, who was supported by many, was ultimately killed by his own troops because he was seen as forsaking the rule of God by giving up his battle and allowing arbitration to take place. So until next time, we'll talk soon. Bye.